kind of puts to one side because of his kind of his focus on kind of a God and theology, and he then goes, as you say, goes to Nietzsche. I think there is a kind of very logical line of development within this series that goes from beginning to the end. And
I agree.
My feeling is that the reference to the de facto, etc., is a bit of a detour that's not really needed, because I think the series itself contains all the information that you need to make sense of it. But I think there are certain terms that we would need to understand. So, for example, the first one is necessity. So I think one would need to have that kind of clear. What is? So he talks about destiny, then he talks about necessity. He talks about the way in which the Stoics kind of, as he says, the Stoics affirm destiny but deny necessity, and that I think is a key point. And then from there, he develops out of that, and I think he goes then towards Leibniz, and he talks there about incompatibility and compossibility. Leaves that behind a little bit. Totally. And goes on to Nietzsche.
I totally agree with you, and I think what we do is, and not to outline what we're talking about, I think sort of in the order, but for me it is about having a conversation around what destiny and necessity mean, because that first paragraph is that. Like, that first paragraph is him sort of laying that out and saying, we need to, like, and this is what the rabbit hole specifically for me is, what destiny and necessity mean here is not really what they mean generally in English language shit. Like, if I were to ask my mom what destiny or necessity mean, the answer is different than what he's, like, it's close. It's not, I'm not saying it's like some different word, but there are some significant subtleties that I think are worth going over for sure. And then from there, going into essentially the compatibility, incompatibility, incompossibility. And I'm not a Leibniz person, and I'm hoping someone here is, to be able to sort of explain down that. I've gone through enough. I'm not going to be able to explain it myself or dive into it, I think I would say.
Yeah, I don't think we need to know that much. I think we just need to understand, like I say, I think we need to understand terminology. So, for example, necessity is the first one. I think destiny, yes, but up to a certain point. And then I think we need to know the kind of basic understanding of compossibility and incompatibility. And because yes. I think it has this bearing on this structure that he develops within this series, I would say. And then I think for me, the end of it then gets kind of complex, but only because I haven't read it that properly, to be honest with you. But that's
this is where
time and trying to understand.
Yeah, exactly. It's as soon as he hits Eternal Return and Aeon, that feels like it's its own almost 2-hour discussion, because there is so much that he says there that, like, genuinely, I don't think there's a way to simplify it. I think up until then, we might be able to burn through, because I do think there is a line, but I don't think it's like it's clear. I don't think it's clear.
I mean, yeah, I have a feeling it will be made clear though in the discussion. That's what I feel about it. But yeah, I kind of, I think I tend to think these things clarify themselves in the discussion. That's my feeling about these.
Well, so far that's been the case. So far that's been the case in these groups. I've been very happy about that. This one, it feels like we're starting to more and more move beyond, here are the foundations of things I'm going to say, to here are the things I'm saying. And there's a lot of things that are dependencies that have to be discussed first, like threads that have to be found before we can weave it together. And I feel like we're starting to hit that. Like, well, I know we are. This one is so complicated.
Yeah, okay. Well, let's see then.
Yeah, let's find out. So I will go ahead and kick us off. It's a little bit of a smaller group. We got more people who will be joining as we go. Please, anyone who wants to take part, we would love to have you in here. But I will start as I always do. Thank you so much for joining us at the Deleuze and Guattari Quarantine Collective's ongoing reading of Logic of Sense. Today we move into the 24th series of the Communication of Events. Super excited to be diving into this. And please, if you like what we're doing, if you do listen to us, please do follow us on Twitter for no reason at all. I don't know why I'm going to stop mentioning our Twitter feed. I hate social media. But we are on Patreon, and every dollar... and DGQC on Patreon, every dollar does actually help us run the server and keep things going, because it costs like $70 a month to run all this bullshit, and we're right about $68, so another dollar or two would be cool. Wouldn't hurt. But with that, we're going to skip announcements and dive right in. The 24th series of the Communication of Events is, if you weren't here for the beginning of me and Derek and our quick discussion of trying to figure out how to do this fucking thing, there's a lot said inside of the 24th series. And when I say a lot, I mean every paragraph is something that we could literally spend probably 2 to 3 hours on, having really good discussions, and I think come out edified and stronger for what we're doing. We may end up doing some level of that. We're going to just go until we start hitting a mark. I'm not going to let this go beyond 2 hours, because Jesus Christ, really. But I think we just sort of start and we just see where this takes us, and we see what happens. I want to open up the first paragraph, and I'm going to open this up with the sentence that I think matters the most. I'm going to read a little bit and get to that, and then we'll just open it up for conversation. So I'll just read from the beginning. One of the boldest moments of the Stoic thought involves the splitting of the causal relation. Causes are referred in depth to a unity which is proper to them, and effects maintain at the surface specific relations of another sort. Destiny is primarily the unity and the link of physical causes among themselves. Incorporeal effects are obviously subject to destiny to the extent that they are the effect of these causes, but to the extent that they differ in nature from these causes, they enter with one another into relations of quasi-causality. Together they enter into a relation with a quasi-cause which is itself incorporeal and assures them of very special independence, not exactly with respect to destiny, but rather with respect to necessity, which normally would have had to follow destiny. The Stoic paradox is to affirm destiny and to deny necessity. The footnote that Deleuze uses there is a journey, because it just says Cicero's De Fato, which is like, cool. Like, yeah, it's cool. That's like 3 pages. That's easy, short read. Yeah. There's a lot to be talked about here. Derek, where would you like to start?
Well, I just think let's just go through it. So basically it starts off by saying, so first we need to understand what is this splitting of the causal relation. And it's basically a split between things in the depth, which are bodies. So causes referred in depth to a unity which is property to them. So that's causes so bodies together, or in the way they mix, have this relationship. So in the depth, a cause of one thing is related to another in the depth. And the other the split is between the causes at the depth and effects at the surface, which are not subject to these bodily causes. And so that's the first thing, the split. This is the split he's talking about, the split of the causal relation.
And it's worth just real quick going back to the example, because I want to just keep attaching it to examples that have come earlier. The discussion of the scalpel that cuts skin. The idea of causes is the skin and its splitting, and the way skin and blood and the scalpel, these elements, but the effect being the thing that is the event around it. Just because it's important when we start talking about like literal causes versus events, I just want to try to keep a line of having it tied to some example. Yeah. So please, Derek, continue.
Yeah, and then he brings in this term destiny, brings this idea of destiny. He says destiny is primarily the link, unity in the link of physical causes amongst themselves. So from this we understand that destiny is related to bodies in the depth. So that's what that sentence says effectively. This notion of destiny, so things which the things which things are moving towards. I mean, again, destiny is a term which I think is, I think we can have a kind of vague understanding of at this point, but it's things perhaps which things move towards. So destiny is primarily unity in the link of physical causes amongst themselves. So he gives not a definition as such, but he links destiny to the bodies. Now he brings in then corporeal effects. He said they're obviously subject to destiny because effects are caused by, not caused by, a result from the bodies. So corporal effects, these are things at the surface, they're obviously subject to destiny to the extent that they are the effect of these causes. So the bodies in their mixtures at depth, they give off these effects. So the bodies themselves are subject to destiny. And as far as the bodies are subject to destiny, therefore the effects are subject to destiny as well. So that's that first little bit, I think. But to the extent that they differ in nature from these causes. So he's now going to talk a little bit about how the effects relate to themselves. To the extent that they differ in nature from these causes, so the bodily causes, they enter with one another. So the incorporeal effects enter relation with one another, into relations of quasi causality. And again, this is something we've come across, we keep coming across, the way in which effects have a relationship of quasi causality. So we have bodies from which the effects are given off, but the relationship is amongst themselves rather than directly back to the bodily thing that caused them to come into being. So he says together, these are the incorporeal effects, enter into relation with a quasi cause, which is itself incorporeal, and assures them a very special independence. So they are independent. So they have a link to the body, but the question then is, what is this special independence? He says it's not exactly with respect to destiny, because as he's already said, there is a link to destiny because the effects are the effects of bodies. So there must be a link at some point to destiny, but rather respect to necessity, which normally would have to follow destiny. So this is, at this point, I think we need to understand what he means by necessity, which would normally have to follow destiny. And I think this is where we need to try and understand that term.
For sure. Well, for me, the way that he's talking about this, if we want to split it into a couple different parts real quick. Destiny and necessity, if we take the phrase, and it's the PDF I linked, I think uses it, and it's an excellent example, is if I say, I went to the doctor and now I'm healthy. Going to the doctor made me healthy. I went to the hospital, it made me better. These are sentences we can say, and they have that level of quasi-causality. Going to the hospital is not what made me healthier. That's not how the bodies worked. This is my way of saying and talking through the sort of events that tied up. I'm putting them together underneath this going to the hospital, which is the thing I'm describing. And we'll get to that. Necessity is the destiny of things is that there is a row of things that happened in order to cause an event to happen. They're not turning away from this. And that's this thing he sort of opens up with, this Stoic element of destiny, the unity and link of physical causes amongst themselves. How we describe them and how events come to be described around them is what gives us that necessity. In order to be healthy, I must go to the doctor. That is the necessity as I understand it. It's maybe more putting a fine point on it, but that's necessity, where I start saying that these events as I'm describing them, or the logical order of the events, is the thing that is the cause, and ultimately the quasi-cause in this case. So for this, the Stoic paradox is we affirm destiny, the order of causes, because there is that, but we deny necessity, which is a determinate ordering of events.
Yeah, so my feeling is that destiny is something that will happen, things will go towards. Whereas necessity is something that might happen, that could happen in the future. So there's this idea of one's destiny is what will happen, whereas necessity is dependent on the future. So it's not a kind of hard and fast thing that will definitely happen. So that I think is the difference between the two. So one is, what shall I say, it's not subject to being altered, which is destiny. Your destiny is your destiny. Whereas necessity can change. It can be one thing or another. So I think that is the difference. They both relate to the future. Both have this futural relationship, but one is destined to happen, but one might happen. It may or may not happen.
So in De Fato, the way Chrysippus talks about logical necessity, the necessity that a true conclusion follows from true premises, should be identified with the correspondence among events that occur according to fate. So to quote from, again, the PDF I posted, it's not the case that Chrysippus argues from the truth of propositions to the necessity of events. Events are not necessary, although they are fated. The truth of incorporeal propositions for Chrysippus lies in their logical convergences, rather in their real or implied reference to actual existing beings. In sum, Chrysippus identifies necessity with relations among bodies, and what we call logical necessity with fate.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, yeah. So, yeah, so I think the fundamental idea, I think, is that future events do not occur by necessity alone. And I think there's a notion of dependence on our own moral judgment, the way in which we do certain things as well, I think, within that idea as well. So,
But
I mean, if you look at the next sentence, yeah, go on.
I was just saying, but doesn't he, like in other parts, sort of develop this kind of retroactive necessity of events, where they sort of retroactively determine themselves as sort of having always happened or being necessary to have happened? Because to me, it seems. I mean, it almost seems like the causal relations between bodies is more contingent for him. At least I get that impression in other parts of the book. So to me, it's kind of interesting that it seems to be that, from what you have said, that here it's the other way around, where there's sort of necessity with bodies, but events are in this sense contingent.
Actually, I'd like to comment there too, because I think I share with you the temptation to see destiny as something we're moving toward, right? And in that sense, it starts to sound kind of teleological. And I was thinking about that more because maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I'm not the definitive Deleuzian. And I think there's room to talk about this. But the way I'm thinking about it after some pondering, I think that when he says destiny here, right, destiny is the primary. Don't drink too much coffee, kids. Destiny is primarily the unity and the link of physical causes among themselves. And when I read that, I think what he's talking about is how do you get sets, right? How do you establish unities between bodies and their mixtures? And that is going to be, I think, what he's calling destiny is the collection of relationships that provide sets. And I think to this point about destiny in terms of what does it do, right? If it's not something we're moving toward, what does it do? Well, if it provides us unity, right, and we're talking about bodies, it sounds like we're in chronos. And so I think that destiny is going to be, if we're putting in a time in that manner, is then going to be contingent on chronos. And therefore, I think it's going to take us back to our discussion of Zeus and God. And as I read it in that way, we're talking about, right, so we've got the temporality of these unities, of these relationships between the bodies and their collection of sets and that, right? So all physical bodies and their mixtures. And I think insofar as we're talking about just bodies here, right, that unity or that fate would then be subject to Zeus or Dia, since he does two functions, right, but God, in terms of the limit, which we'll see how he's going to criticize Leibniz. But I think that's what's going on is it might not be so much that we're moving toward destiny. It might be that the collection of sets we're dealing with provides us the destiny as relationships, and in that way they bump up against the unity, or that unity bumps up against Zeus or Dia as basically establishing the limit as far as Chronos, or like just being, to keep it simple, is concerned.
I'd like to. So
Yeah,
one of
I
the
think
things I have a question about specifically is the use of destiny as this idea of something we're moving towards, or that there is an almost element of inevitability or things like that. I'm curious, sort of where we're getting that from. I have a different take. I'm just very curious specifically to focus on destiny here.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I don't think we are moving towards Chronos at all. I mean, I don't think destiny is the focus. I think the focus is necessity, because he said at the beginning that bodies are destiny is unity and link of physical causes. So destiny is implicit in bodies, and he said, and because the incorporeal effects have this relation, have a kind of link. They're given off by the bodies. They also have a link to destiny. But the difference is, he said, the Stoics. He said the Stoic paradox is to affirm destiny. So the Stoics are going to affirm destiny, but they're going to deny necessity. And this, I think, is the key. The key is this denial of necessity, that things must happen in a certain way. And necessity is a kind of, let's call it a slightly watered down version of destiny. So from destiny, what necessity follows destiny. If your destiny is this to happen, the necessity that this must also happen. So there is that relationship there. But he says that the Stoics deny necessity. So there is not this kind of inevitable link between destiny and necessity. And the next sentence, I think, shows the way, it begins to show how this link is broken. So he says the wise person is free in two ways, which conform to the two poles of ethics. So there's this breaking this link, and I think this is what the focus is about. Because, well, we could read the rest of this section, because this series is called The Communication of Events. So it's about how events communicate. And this is the first step in that direction, by saying that the link with necessity is broken. So if we were just talking about bodies have a destiny, and for that destiny to be fulfilled, that it has to function through necessity. So there's a kind of logical line of development from that. But he's saying, because the Stoics have split the incorporeal bodies, the causes, the incorporeal effects from the bodies, they then split this idea of destiny and necessity, one following from the other. And this is the kind of line of development he's going to develop in this series. And what it's about how events communicate, as the title suggests.
See, for me, destiny, as I'm reading it, is almost like a, I don't know, hyper-materialist view. It is the total unity of causes, bodies, just everything that is as it is, not events, not anything else, just pool balls running into each other as a thing, this unity of them. The nature of the second step, which is events, which is that of the surface, these ideas and conceptions and all that, events themselves can't cause each other. Bodies do things, and we assign value to them through the entire process that he outlines in the logical, the ontological, and those series. But what we're talking about here specifically is this odd nature of quasi-cause things. Again, I'm going to go back to the example that you go to the doctor and you get better. I'm sick, I go to the doctor, I get better. It's not going to the doctor that made me better. Those are two events that I am linking and putting a quasi-cause in there. Now, the underlying bodies, as bodies happened, that, again, not talking about that I went, but Brooks's bodies and medicine and the the shot and the needle and all of these things that happened as the bodies sort of moved and did their thing. This is the destiny. There is a reality that is all encompassing that holds them. But the necessity is when I start saying things like going to the doctor caused me to get better. This is the problem, is necessity, saying that you must do X to get Y, linking events as if they were causes to each other, and they're not. Necessity is demanding that, hey, we did this dance and it rained, therefore we need to do our rain dance in order to make it rain. There's that we look at nowadays even as silly, but he goes later and describes great examples from biology and evolution of saying, oh, well, this one thing is this one element of color in a butterfly versus this color makes them stronger or weaker. And it's like, no, they're related, but they're not causes. And when we start removing that nature from things and start removing that distinction, we start separating out destiny from necessity, excoriating one and destroying the other. That's what puts us in a position to be able to see things and talk through things in a much stronger way. This is the Stoic core thing that Deleuze is really trying to push, this idea of fatalism, the incompatibilities or compatibilities amongst events based on this aleatory point. To go back through the entire series we've talked through from the beginning of paradoxes and all of this, these non-causal compatibilities and incompatibilities are the way events talk to each other and are communicated. And that's this series is about that. How do these events talk? How do we talk through them? And we do it by kind of fucking up. So ultimately, like we add this quasi causality to them, this necessity to certain events. That's how I'm reading the difference between the two. Am I far off from anyone else?
Yeah, I think no, I don't think you are, but I don't think this is the focus of this series, though. I think the focus of this series is what are the implications of splitting? So the splitting of the causal relation, as we say it right, the first sentence, in which the bodily causes split from the incorporeal effects, and then through this the relationship of destiny and the relation of necessity, which normally follows. So incorporeal effects have a relationship to bodies, but and so from that they do have a relation to destiny. But then the idea of necessity is split off from that, and this gives us there's certain implications of this, which I've laid out at the end of this paragraph, and then that forms the structure which is followed for the rest of the series, I would say. So he talks about, again, I mean, I find this kind of complex, to be honest with you, but the wise person is free in two ways, which conform to the two poles of ethics. Free in the first instance, because one soul can attain to interiority of perfect physical causes, and again, because one's mind may enjoy very special relationships established between effects in a set situation for exteriority. So there's this kind of duality being developed there. And this, what he says, the essential thing he says here is that he says, so let's just go to the next. On one hand, events, effects maintain a relation of causality with their physical causes, which he's already said that, but without this relation being one necessity. He said it's a relation of expression, and expression is something we've already come across previously. So within the, it's something that's contained. It's if I can't remember which series it was, but we had this notion of the sense is something that's expressed. It's contained within the expression, within the sense. So it's a relation of expression rather than one of necessity. And on the other hand, they have between them, or with their ideational quasi-cause, no longer a relation of causality, but rather, once again, and this time exclusively, a relation of expression. So necessity is replaced by this notion of expression, which I which as I've said, is something we've come across earlier, which I didn't have a chance to look up, but I do know we did. This was a kind of important element in a previous series. So then from that, the first question he asks, the first thing he says in the next paragraph, he says, the question becomes, what are these expressive relations of events? And I think this then forms the structure of the rest of the series. So the first paragraph is saying the way in which the incorporeal causes, corporal effects, are split off from their bodily causes, let's say, their relationship to that. And they still have a relation to destiny, but they don't have this relation to necessity, and it's one of expression. They have what he calls a relation of expression. And the question becomes, what are these expressive relations of events? So events communicate with each other. So the question is, this series is called the communication events in terms of expression, which is, like I say, it's a thing that's already come up previously. So
and I like
me.
Varun, just to mention, Varun tosses out a definition that's quick. Something that an expression is something that doesn't exist without the other thing, but at the same time cannot be reduced to it. Expression of an element, expression of a word, things like that. It doesn't exist without the other thing, but at the same time cannot be reduced to it. It's a great quick one. Contextual determinations is a great way to put it.
Yeah.
That's nice.
Yeah, I think that the expression in this sense, I've just found I think I found the reference. It's to do with, remember, one of the things that we talked about is representation, the idea of representation. So we had the idea of the actor, the way the actor represents, and it's through the actor and the character they portray of this special relationship. And so it's the internal. I'm just going to read here. Right. So representation encompasses or envelops an expression. So this is, I would say, is where this idea of expression is being developed, because it's relating to that earlier idea we had of, and where the actor is a good example of this, of someone who represents, and in which they take on the character. The character exists as this, in this kind of, as an incorporeal effect given off by the actor in terms of representation. And the expression, what's expressed, is contained within the representation. And so now the question is, what are these expressive relations of events?
So back to the idea of necessity. Are you saying that necessity is left behind in the realm of the states of affairs and bodies? And that's what the Stoics mean by affirming destiny and denying necessity. Is that correct?
Yeah. So the relation, there is a relationship between destiny, that thing that must happen, and necessity, which could happen in this way, it could happen in that way. Perhaps that's a way of thinking about the relationship between the two. And the Stoics, what they do is they deny necessity, and it's replaced by this notion of expression.
Oh, okay. Yeah, denying.
I see. Maybe I'm saying it wrong, but I feel like it's maybe even more simple than that. With bodies, we're talking about things almost pre-representation. The entire thing leading up to this, and a lot of the stuff that's referenced here, specifically later on, the aleatory point, the series, the way that paradoxes work, nonsense and sensor generated, all of these things, is coming up to the point of saying, on the one hand, we have bodies, the material reality of what things are at any given moment, the snapshot of them. And then we have event, which is generated out of the interactions of those bodies through our perception, and senses produced out of these elements, and we create events. Events themselves can't be causal. They are essentially our understanding of things as they are. They're not any specific reality. They're not causal in the same way bodies are, or states of affairs. Events are the things generated out of that. As such, the line is the incorporeal versus corporeal, and events are by necessity incorporeal. Something that's incorporeal can't ever be a cause. Yet you will hear people say things like, I went to the doctor and that made me better. That's not how that works. Or I struggled through my youth, but I became rich and that made me stronger. These things that we call quasi causes are these events that are not bodies. They're not actual causes, which are sort of ramming into each other all the time in a lot of ways, but they're the way that we've made sense of them. We have turned them into stories and turned them into propositions through the way that these things function. And the separation of these two elements of the corporeal and incorporeal is, to me, the thing he's focusing on here. And as we move into this next bit where we're talking about the expressive relation of events, we're specifically talking about the relations of incorporeal elements within how we speak and how we communicate. Because we do have, and it's specifically, this next paragraph is specifically talking about essentially talking through events and how we allow ourselves to do it. How do we allow one to be compatible with another? They're not bodies which, may directly or indirectly plug into each other or mix in various different ways. These are events that we're assigning. So how does one become the quasi cause of another or relate to it? How do we not say, oh, look, I stubbed my toe, now I'm a millionaire? Like that would not be how we would do it. We wouldn't talk about these things. What allows us to bring destiny about at the level of events? What brings an event to repeat another in spite of all of its difference? What makes it possible that a life is composed of one and the same event despite a variety of what may happen, that it is traversed by a single and same fissure, that it play one and the same air over all possible tunes and all possible words? All of these are not due to the relations between cause and effect. It is rather an aggregate of non-causal correspondences which form a system of echoes. This idea of the necessity, the events sort of creating their own story, separated and becoming their own thing, instead of thinking through that cause and effect are effectively like one and the same. This separation is key to it, and it's a crisp separation, not like a blurry one.
I have a question. But the way we described it, it almost seems like, and this is something that has kind of confused me generally about this book, but it seems that wait a second. It seems that in the example that you gave, that the causal or quasi-causal relation between the events is established in that sentence. So it seems in that example only when you utter that sentence that there is a kind of quasi-causal relation. But in other parts in this chapter, it almost seems that events all have kind of inherently quasi-causal relation to other events. So,
They do.
I mean, it's kind of, yeah. So is he just kind of, because it seems to me that what he's getting at rather is just the kind of logical possibility for a kind of connection, rather than the kind of, yeah, so he's kind of maybe like after the condition of possibility between the quasi-causal relation and not the sort of actual existence of a relation because it seems to me that there are two different things, because two events could have a kind of logical possibility for a connection, but if no one ever brings them together in a sentence, then there wouldn't be like an actual connection. Doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, well, one, anything I say, take with a grain of salt, just in general, that this is just how I'm interpreting it. And I'm really trying to work through this because this is, I think, very complex. But to me, the point you're talking about is, I think, what we're going to be getting into in just a moment, which is the idea of how these events become quasi-causal or connected in logic, and how these things become like essentially a chain of elements. When we talked earlier, and I think it was the second series that dives right into this shit, that talks about how Events themselves, like cause and effect, and we need to sort of separate those, uses the example I mentioned earlier of the scalpel that cuts through flesh. To quote, when the scalpel cuts through flesh, the first body produces upon the second not a new property, but a new attribute, that of being cut. The attribute does not designate a quality. It is, to the contrary, always expressed by the verb, which means that it is not a being, but a way of being. This way of being finds itself somehow at the limit, at the surface of being, the nature of which it is not able to change. It is neither active nor passive. Passivity would presuppose a corporeal nature. It's purely and simply a result or an effect which is not to be classified amongst beings. These two planes, the effect and cause, this separation, he's kind of reaching back from that second one and pulling back and saying, this is where we need to sort of start from in this bit.
Yeah, I think if we just go to the beginning of this paragraph, the second paragraph, so the question becomes, so he says the question because what it said in the previous paragraph, the question becomes, what are these expressive relations of events? So what is the expressive, how events relate to in terms of expression? Now he then goes to say, between events there seem to be formed extrinsic relations of silent compatibility. I think the word silent there is very important because we are, and I think, I didn't notice who was speaking previously, but the previous speaker indicated it is what's being said. In a sense, it's what's implicit within what's being spoken. But he says here, it seems to be formed extrinsic relations of silent compatibility or incompatibility of conjunction or disjunction, which are very difficult to apprehend. So we have these terms of compatibility, incompatibility between events, conjunction or disjunction, but how do they come about? And the question is, what makes an event compatible or incompatible with another? That's the question that's being asked now. And he says we can't appeal to causality since it is a relation of effects amongst themselves. So the effects relate to each other in terms of quasi causes, not in terms of causality. And then he talks about how destiny, this notion of destiny, happens between events. So what brings destiny about the level of events? So how does destiny manifest itself in events? And then he gives a description of this destiny working. What brings an event to repeat another in spite of all its difference? What makes it possible that life is composed of one and of the same event, despite the variety of what might happen? And so this structure here is giving this relationship. He's saying this is the relationship in terms of between events, in terms of compatibility, incompatibility, conjunction or disjunction. And he said, but these relations are not due to relations between cause and effect. It's rather an aggregate of non-causal correspondence which form a system of echoes, resumptions, resonance, a system of signs. And in short, an expressive quasi-causality. So what he does here, he extends this notion of a quasi-causality and makes it an expressive quasi-causality. And it's not, and again, it's repeating this. He's replaced the idea of necessity with the notion of expression. So he said it's an expressive quasi-causality and not at all necessitating causality. And he then goes back to Chrysippus, insists on the transformation of hypothetical propositions into conjunctives or disjunctives. He shows well the impossibility of events expressing their conjunctions and disjunctions in terms of brute causality. So this is something, again, we previously looked at. So a hypothetical proposition is, and the one he gives, if it is day, it is light. Those are, on the face of it, they're hypothetical propositions, but they're transformed. So the basic, and something that's going to be developed in the next paragraph, so I won't go into it too much, but this is what this is referring to. It's something that we've previously come across. So the field we're dealing with here is logic. So we're dealing with the kind of way in which propositions relate to each other, how what is said relates to each other, the sense that's given off and when we say something, and how that relates to each other. And I think so. This is what's being set up here. Is this again? It's this relationship, this kind of expressive, this idea of expressive quasi-causality is being developed.
Yeah, I don't disagree with any of that. I think that's spot on. The line here I really like is this idea of where it says, it is rather an aggregate of non-causal correspondences which form a system of echoes, resumptions, and resonances, a system of signs, in short, an expressive quasi-causality, and not at all a necessitating causality. That's the shift he's wanting to sort of push, is to head back towards this, that it's not, again, Alice gets bigger, or the first 4 or 5 series, which I recommend people go back and read to help sort of make through this, especially as we're about to get into the hypothetical proposition section. But just a shift in thinking through how these things operate, and the way that events work and express their elements within logical systems. Corey Shore's book, The Logic of Gilles Deleuze, is excellent towards this. But talking through how they express their conjunctions and disjunctions in terms of brute causality, how these things function, because we have to discuss events. We have to have, they have to communicate in some way. I think it's more of a, we have to do this. This is the beginning kind of that discussion.
Is he saying that
I think go on.
I was just going to ask a question. Does he mean by the system of system of echoes and the system of signs? Is he talking about propositional language propositions? Is that what he's saying? That's what describing what events are?
The chain of events, the idea that we here are 12 events that need to happen for you to be successful. Let's say I wrote a book called The 12 Rules for Success or something, and I sounded like Kermit. The way of me saying these events, here are the causes, here are the elements. It's like, no, to step back a little bit. Let's not talk about the chain of these things, these events. Let's talk through instead about how these things operate, rather than saying that they are causes themselves.
Sure, right.
Yeah, I think what's being looked for is like you said previously. It says so the events can have a relation of compatibility or incompatibility, or they can come apart. So it says, how does this happen? Now, if we go into the next paragraph, he sort of makes this clearer, I think. So he says, is it necessary then to invoke identity and contradiction? So identity is something is the same as something else, and a contradiction says something is not the same as something else. So these are just the two basic ways in which things come together. Would two events being, so he's going to focus on incompatibility events. Would two events be incompatible because they were contradictory? So this would seem to be logical, if they kind of speak against each other, they must be somehow incompatible. But then he goes on to say, is this not a case of applying rules to events which apply only to concepts, predicates, and classes? So he says that this is the wrong way to approach this question of compatibility, incompatibility. It's not through logic, rules of, let's call it grammar or whatever, that applies to predicates, to concepts and predicates and classes. So we mustn't apply that rule. So, and then he goes on, even with respect to a hypothetical proposition. So if it is day, it is light. So those are hypothetical propositions. So the first one in the proposition is the hypothetical proposition, if it is day, and therefore what comes off that is it is light. So the second proposition is reliant on the first, but he said the Stoics noted that contradiction must be found on a single level. So in that first one, if it is day, it is light. The it is light is a kind of a lower level than the first one. It is dependent on it. So he says this, but the Stoics saw these things, they must come together at a single level. So the Stoics noted that contradiction must be defined on a single level. So rather, the contradiction must be defined as space between the principle itself, in that case, if it is day, and the negation of the consequence. And he gives an example. If it is day, it is not light. So it's got to be defined somewhere in between them. and so one is not at a different level to the other.
Yeah, I think it's worth just really quick reading through the example he gives, because I think it makes a lot of what you're saying clear here, Derek, if you don't mind. Just quick, if we isolate the discussion he's talking about is butterflies. It is held, for example, that a species of butterfly cannot be at once gray and vigorous. Either the specimens are gray and weak, or they are vigorous and black. We can always assign a causal physical mechanism to explain this incompatibility, a hormone, for example, on which the predicate gray would depend, and which would soften or weaken the corresponding class. And we can conclude from this causal condition that there is a logical contradiction between gray and vigorous. But if we isolate the pure events, we see that to turn gray is no less positive than to turn black. It expresses an increase in security, as much as the becoming black is an increase of vigor. Between these two determinations, each of which has its advantage, there is initially a relation of primary event-mental incompatibility. Physical causality inscribes the incompatibility only secondarily in the depth of the body, and the logical contradiction translates it only in the content of the concept. In short, the relations of events among themselves, from the point of view of an ideational or noematic quasi-causality, first expresses non-causal correspondence, alogical compatibilities, or incompatibilities. This example, I think, it's a pretty crisp one. So just sharing.
Yeah, that's right. I think it is a great example. So this is the line of thought. So that Stoics, that they, as he said, the Stoics' strength was in committing themselves to this line of thought. According to what criteria events, copulata, confrontalia, or incompatibilia, conjuncta, or disjuncta. So I think copulata, the things that join things, the things that break them apart, essentially. So so the expressiveness of events is not one of a kind of a logic according to propositional logic, or the logic which says one thing will follow another, or one thing won't follow another. The two things that come together must be at the same level.
So one of the
and that example, as you said.
Yeah, the question I did have in this paragraph that I'm curious if anyone has thoughts on, because I don't, I'm just curious, is the last line where astrology was perhaps the first important attempt to establish a theory of alogical incompatibilities and non-causal correspondences. It's such a weird sentence, and anyone, please. I don't really have an interpretation of it. It feels like he's saying, I can't tell if he's being cheeky or not, I guess is my question. Is he being cheeky? Feels cheeky.
No, believe it or not, he's not being cheeky. If you read some of the Stoics, like I can't think of the guy's name, but the guy who wrote the Enchiridion, or like the handbook in English. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the name. But he actually talks about, so it's like it's kind of like what Deleuze is talking about here, right? Insofar as it's Stoic, but he'll actually talk about going to the oracle and how to understand your engagement with the oracle, right? So no, that was kind of actually taking seriously the whole idea of astrology, where, as you've seen in this book elsewhere, divination, but it's not exactly like the sort of witchcrafty view we kind of come to inherit.
But I think he's also like trying to say that I guess you could say that like different astrological readings, they can sort of coexist in the same way that events coexist. Like they don't logically exclude each other. So you have like one reading and another reading of the stars or whatever. Maybe like it's the same sort of relation that the gray and black have, in the sense that it's not a question of of logical exclusions, but rather a sort of divergence where different readings can go or whatever. Maybe that makes sense.
So is astrology something like the idea of synchronicity, that you can explain things alogically and non-causally? So astrology finds a relationship between certain events, and make that relationship, and frame that relationship as if they are true, but there's no logic to it, and there's no explanation of a cause. There's no, you're born on a certain date, and you are, you know, uh, you're you have this kind of personality, or you have this, you're born with certain characteristics, and this will happen at a certain time and date. So is that what he's saying? But is he agreeing with that view, and not and not criticizing it? So is he saying there's some truth to that idea of non-causality and illogical thinking?
I don't think he's. So this is going to sound, since we're going on the word of the day being cheeky, this is going to sound cheeky. I don't think he's talking about horoscopes. But all joking aside,
I do.
No, I don't think he is, because I don't think astrology operated that way at this time. Like I said earlier, it's kind of something we've inherited with a different perspective. But I think what he's trying to work out here in his reading of the Stoics is the way that something like astrology, or as we've seen otherwise, like processes of different divination, or in the Enchiridion, like the oracle, how can it be possible to think through relationships of expression without relying on causality? Or said differently, how can we explain what effects do with each other without tying them down to the bodies, right? If they're communicating with each other in this nonverbal, um, resounding way, the interactions are productive in that manner, right? And we have these ideas of copula, confatilia, conjuncta, disjuncta, right? The effects are doing all these things together, and they have a relationship with bodies, but the relationship with bodies is not necessarily what makes effects and events more directly. What makes those events happen the way they happen, right? Do what they do. Why does bleeding happen to the hand and the scalpel the way it does in that instance? And I think Deleuze is looking to astrology as a way of they're trying to work out through logic and through ontology how these relationships actually function, as opposed to falling back on just like more simple causality.
So I can say Chrysippus for sure totally believe people born under certain signs had certain behaviors they were intent. Like when we say astrology, it may not be like Cancer as we know it and like horoscopes. It's 100% the idea that the heavenly bodies determine a person's personality and actions. Like they explored that and they pushed hard into that. That's why I'm confused here. So it's totally that. Like it is totally that. It's not like the super hard hyper determinant, but like, yeah, they like.
I think the income. I mean, I guess just to understand what I think we need to understand what illogical incompatibilities are. So a non-causal correlation. I'm just trying to think. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think it is a bit of an aside. I think it's serious, a serious aside, but I think it is an aside, really.
Well, it's a quick aside, but it's one that I think because he. So like, is the comment here like the Stoics went so hard because this is the thing is the strength was committing to this line of thought. According to a criteria, are events copulata, confatalia, conjuncta, or disjuncta, and astrology is the first, which is probably actually a fair assessment to say, hey, actually, they wanted to create something where there's no fucking bodies. Like, this is totally alogical incompatibilities and non-causal correspondences. They wanted to have events, because this is a thing that Crispus said quite often, I think, was if there is an event, there is no event without a cause, I think, is one of the things. I may be misphrasing that, but that's it, I think, the gist. And so the idea of astrology and Crispus going so deep was trying to find a logic to just pure events and how logic sort of chased things. And this non-causal correspondences, essentially, I think this is Deleuze's line of astrology was the first attempt to do what I am now going to carry out through the remainder of the series, which is to actually talk about how these incompatibilities and compatibilities work and how non-causal correspondences operate. That's how it felt to me reading it. It's just such a weird aside out of nowhere. Suddenly, bam, here's astrology. And it's like, okay. Yeah, it's not worth charging too far down that line. Then the next sort of element here is when we start getting into Leibniz. Is anyone here versed well in Leibniz? Because it would be embarrassing if I were to start. So if anyone wants to sort of jump in and talk through this paragraph and talk through Leibniz, his sort of, it's worth mentioning his sort of theological background and the things that informed him and his sort of beliefs around compossibility or incompatibility. If anyone wants to try that, it ain't going to be me.
Well, it's something it's already been touched upon, but I mean, yeah, if there's anyone who wants to develop this further. But the first thing he says that before he gets to Leibniz, he says, it seems, however, if we follow the surviving partial deceiving text, he says the Stoics may not have been able to resist the double temptation of return to simple physical causality of the logical contradiction. So he's saying that even though the Stoics set out this notion of illogical incompatibilities, he said they perhaps didn't follow it through. And they perhaps returned to this notion of physical causality or the logical contradiction. One thing will contradict thing that. So two seemingly incompatible propositions will contradict each other rather than being not contradicting their sense, shall we say. So he goes on to say the first theoretician of illogical incompatibilities. And therefore the first important theoretical event was Leibniz, for what Leibniz called. And then we need to understand what does Leibniz mean by compossible and incompossible? These are two obviously key concepts for Leibniz. And so what Deleuze says here, so incompossible. So we have in there the notion of possible and possible, but they're compossible and incompossible. So these two phrases seem to kind of negate each other. But he says for what Leibniz called compossible and incompossible cannot reduce the identical, the contradictory. So again, we can't return to this kind of propositional logic of one thing denying the other. He says, which govern only the possible and the impossible.
I mean, the way I understand.
Go on.
I mean, I'm not an expert on Leibniz either, but I read that book. It's called, I think, Alex Tiziana. It's called Affirming Divergence. Deleuze's reading of Leibniz. And the way I understand it is that since Leibniz has this kind of idea of this kind of predetermination, we have all these different worlds, and in these worlds there are sort of relations between the monads. And sort of in a sense, every word is kind of serious. So we have this kind of infinity of series, and of course God picks the perfect world, the best series. And I think the difference between compossibility or incompatibility and between and contradiction is that if we have a contradiction, we have a sort of contradiction in the same worlds. So there's a kind of exclusion. But because composability and incompossibility refer to kind of entirely different theories, there isn't this sense of exclusion. Because if two things are incompossible, this means that there are. So Deleuze, I think on YouTube there's a lecture he gives at Vincennes where he talks about this in relation to Leibniz, this famous example, if Caesar crosses the Rubicon, and if Caesar doesn't cross the Rubicon in this world, and sort of the things that happen after are incompossible in the series. But it's not a contradiction because we just have an entirely different world. So I think that's what I mean. I think it sounds a lot like contradiction, but I think what attracts Deleuze to it is that it's not meant to be contradiction. We just have this kind of splitting of series or events. Then, of course, what Deleuze thinks that Leibniz is kind of too obsessed with harmony. That's ultimately his critique of Leibniz, that Leibniz doesn't fully understand that we need to affirm the divergence between the theories. We shouldn't look for the perfect harmony. We should look what happens when these theories diverge, and when we have a kind of difference, but it's not contradiction. And I think in this sense, it's sort of an alternative to dialectics. I don't know if it makes any sense, but yeah, that's how I understand it.
Yeah, so just to follow on from that, so he says that, just to repeat, what Leibniz called compossible and incompossible cannot reduce the identical and contradictory, which could only possible the impossible. Then he says compossibility does not even presuppose the inherence of predicates in individual subject or monad. It is rather the inverse. Inherent predicates are those which correspond to events from the beginning compossible. So he gives the example, the monad of Adam the sinner includes in predicative form many future and past events which are compossible with the sin of Adam. So I think the essential idea of compossible is that each individual, don't perhaps not use that word, but what's compossible? The monad, each individual, yes, each monad has within it certain things that, so for example, the monad of Adam, the sinner, the only thing that can be compossible with Adam the sinner are predicates of the future and past which relate to the sin of Adam. So the monad of Adam, it's in a world in which Adam sins. So the things we can say of Adam can only relate to the fact that Adam is a sinner. Similar to that example you gave of Caesar crossing the Rubicon, the understanding of the monad of Julius Caesar is one who crosses the Rubicon. Now, the idea within this is that there can be other monads, there can be other worlds in which Caesar doesn't cross the Rubicon, or in which Adam does not sin, and so, but the predicates that relate to in Adam can only relate to Adam as a sinner in that monad, but another monad you might have Adam as a non-sinner. Therefore, the predicates can relate to him in terms of Adam as a non-sinner. And he goes on to talk about incompossibility. So we have this notion of divergence of series within the compossibility, and because incompossibility must be defined by the divergence of such series. If another sex is than the one we know is than the one we know, so if another sex is the one we know is incompossible with our world, it's because he would correspond to singularity, series of which would diverge from a series of our world, clustered around the Adam, the Gilles, the Christ, and the Leibniz that we know. So it's this notion of, like, in a sense, he gives the example later on. I don't know if he does it here actually, but he did when he first talked about this notion of Borges, the gardener. I can't remember the title of Forking Paths, I think it's called, in which there is this notion of if this happened, then this could happen, or that could happen, or that might happen. So there's a notion of endlessly forking alternative. So which kind of works within this Leibnizian model of monads, of possibilities, which conform to the monad. So the Adam the sinner is the monad, is the thing that he is, but we can also Adam the non-sinner, etc., etc.
Well, and all of this comes from, with Leibniz specifically. I shouldn't jump in on this. I've only sort of read Leibniz. It does come from God. It's a very specific thing, and Deleuze calls it out here very cleanly, because all of this comes from God sort of authoring the world. Think of it as the intelligent designer, if you will. The world is made of compossible things because God is able to, from high above, select them, place them, sort of put them together in the order that they're in. And as such, things are compossible. They're individuals that can exist together. And we have this issue that, again, Deleuze sort of calls out very cleanly. How do we sort of have these two elements, the compossible and incompossible, as they are? But he immediately dives into, in the next paragraph here, he made use of a negative use of divergence, of disjunction, one of exclusion. This is justified, however, only to the extent that events are already grasped under the hypothesis of a God who calculates and chooses, and from the point of view of their actualization in distinct worlds or individuals. It's no longer justified if we consider pure events and the ideal play, whose principle Leibniz was unable to grasp, because, well, he was a super godly type guy. The play here is basically talking about, to me again, moving from the top down and instead to production, the creation of these things as they move. And it's at this point, the divergence of series, the disjunction of members cease to be negative rules of exclusion. Divergence and disjunction are, on the contrary, affirmed as such. And this means, as he says, two things become affirmed only to the extent that their difference is denied, suppressed from within, or even the level of the suppression is supposed to regulate the production of difference as much as its disappearance. This chat through how difference sort of comes to be feels like he's sort of throwing back over to difference and repetition and a lot of his work there. I won't go too deep in it. It's been a long time since I read DNR. Yes, sorry for the short little ramble, but felt appropriate. No?
And I just think we're moving into difficult territory.
We are. I mean, this is where this starts getting into that.
Yeah.
Like now that we've got, like, I wanted to move past Leibniz because this next part is this idea of the synthesis of the disjunction, which, yes, is going to come up, and it's pointing towards AO. It's pointing to a lot of later works as well. This is incredibly dense. Like, then every sentence I feel like we could spend time on, and I'm not certain how to tackle this, to be honest.
Right. I think just looking at this. So I mean, the thread that runs through this up to now anyway is this notion of how events can be met, how things can be compatible with each other or incompatible. They can be brought together or taken apart. And then I'm just trying to get to actually is this idea of difference, which he brings up in the next paragraph, which is obviously very important for Deleuze. So he wrote a book called Difference and Repetition. And I think this notion of the kind of things excluding. So their difference is a thing through which they are separated from each other. So it's one of separation. Whereas, so if we go to, I don't know if you can find this, my copy is page 178. So at the top of page 178, which is about a third of the way down the next paragraph, the big one that begins with Leibniz, though, makes use of this rule. So he says that as a general rule, two things are simultaneously affirmed only to the extent that their difference is denied. So this notion of two things come together is as a general rule is only to the they're different. Yeah, they can be brought together because of their difference. They're denied in terms of difference. It's denied, suppressed from within. Even the level of this suppression is supposed to regulate the production of difference as much as its disappearance. I think that this is. I think this is complex, very complex. So, but I'm going to sort of try and battle through it a little bit. To be sure, the identity here. So the word identity is important. It means one thing is another thing, or is like it is another thing. Let's say, isn't it? It is not that of indifference. So one thing is indifferent to each other, but it's generally through identity that opposites are affirmed at the same time. So identity, yeah. So two opposites can be affirmed through identity. That seems to be saying. Whether we accentuate one of the opposites in order to find the other, or whether we create a synthesis of the two. So dealing with this notion of identity, when if we say, I don't know, identity, A is A, that's a kind of fundamental basic identity. A is what is A. So A, the subject and the predicate of A, what it is A. That's identity. So it says generally through identity. So we're one thing associated with another, the opposites are affirmed at the same time. So we can say the opposites are affirmed through identity. So that seems to be suggesting opposites can say, so we say A is not A. Therefore, that's a saying of identity which affirms the opposites. It can stop me if I'm rambling, but I'm trying to get there. But it's generally through identity that opposite affirms, whether we accentuate one of the opposites in order to find the other, or whether we create a synthesis of two. Synthesis of the two. We speak in the contrary of an operation according to which two things or two denominators affirmed through their difference. So he's saying what he's talking about, I think, here. So that is a kind of little detour, but the actual thing he wants to focus on is when he starts off by saying we speak. So he's talking about what he's actually talking about, on the contrary of an operation according to which two things or two denominators are affirmed through their difference. So normally things are affirmed not through their identity, but now he's saying that things are affirmed through their difference. And again, this is obviously looking ahead to something back, I can't remember which order they're in, but difference and repetition is important. So there's no such difference here. So he's saying two determinations are affirmed through their difference. That is to say, they're the object of simultaneous affirmation only insofar as their difference itself affirms and is itself affirmative. And I think this is to do. You go on, yeah.
No, because I recently read Difference and Repetition, and James Williams in his guide has a good example for this. If we think about a series of paintings, sort of like abstract, like Rothko style paintings, and they all look very similar, but they're different paintings. And usually, if we would say, how can we determine a painting so that it's different from the others, the specific painting? And usually we would look at each painting, look at their attributes, their characteristics, and then say, okay, this painting is like this, this painting is like this, and we can see, okay, they're different, there are differences. And so the determination of a painting is through starting sort of from the identity. We look at this painting and we can see what a painting is, and then we can see, okay, it's not this. But Deleuze sort of thinks the sort of series between Deleuze thinks the differences between the paintings as its own positive being. So the paintings are a sort of positive ontological being, but the sort of modulations between each painting, the way the paint differs, the color, the tone, all of these differences form a kind of series, and the series has its own positive ontological status. I think that's sort of also affirming difference or affirming divergence in the sense that we can productively determine things purely starting from the pure difference between identities.
Yeah, I think it would be worth probably having a larger discussion on this, but that's a really great way to sort of describe it. It's the way of looking at things not as if there is this all-encompassing thing and we're slowly slicing off pieces and that we're doing like this negative action by carving stuff out, but instead that as we discover difference becomes a thing. Almost if we start with nothing and I show you 10 paintings, as you assign qualities or differences between them, those are actual, like, think of it as like bubbles of elements that pop up. And it's like, oh, now I know what contrast is. Contrast is a difference, but these are like positive things I'm understanding about the world that are allowing it. It's this really, it's a opposite way of looking at things very often, but I really do like it. I love your example. The paintings one is great.
So is he trying to distinguish himself from Leibniz, in which he, the idea of compossibility and incompossibility was a way of excluding difference in the discussion, understanding of what, and so it sounds like Deleuze is bringing back difference to show that how Leibniz was limited in his understanding of, and that he's trying to bring us back to back to a discussion of Nietzsche's, right, perspectivism.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right, but also the way I understand it is that he specifically reads Leibniz compossibility and incompossibility as an alternative to Hegel. So he reads differently, but he thinks it's sort of an opportunity to come to a concept of positive difference, because there isn't this kind of moment of well, there is, but if you throw out God in Leibniz, then you have this kind of non-contradictory, non-negative reading of compossibility and incompossibility, where you can have sort of difference without negation. So he is, in this sense, I think, committed to Leibniz, but obviously like his reading of Leibniz.
And not to simplify it too much, but if I were to say in the sort of the Hegelian way of synthesis and antithesis and of antithesis, thesis, synthesis is you take differences and with any luck differences collapse and you simplify, you have a new idea, essentially, which views differences as being something that we need to overcome as problems ultimately. Whereas Deleuze is taking that with compossibility and incompossibility and looking at it the other direction and saying, these differences are these positive aspects that as sort of, that allow us to have these other elements. Is that close or am I far off? Because his example there, and he does directly mention Hegel, Leibniz, Hegel, and Nietzsche in a single paragraph is like that's a lot. Because the line he has, it is not difference which must go as far as contradiction, as Hegel thought in his desire to accommodate the negative. It is the contradiction which must reveal the nature of its difference, as it follows the distance corresponding to it. The idea of positive distance belongs to topology and surface. It excludes all depth and elevation, which would restore the negative and the identity. Nietzsche provides the examples for such a procedure, which must not, under any circumstances, be confused with some unknown identity of contraries. Nietzsche exhorts us to live health and sickness in a manner that health be a perspective on sickness and sickness a perspective on health. That is a very crisp way, and he says the quote, looking from the perspective of the sick towards healthier concepts and values, and conversely, looking again from the fullness and self-assurance of a rich life down into a secret work of the instinct of decadence. In this I have had the longest training, my truest experience. If in anything I became master in this, now I know how, have the know-how to reverse perspectives. This is an amazing operation that he's playing with here, and it feels like it feels very profound. Am I far off as a simplistic explanation, I guess?
It sounds right. I mean, I think the thing he's doing, it seems, is recuperating the negative, and he talks about this notion of positive distance, which is almost a kind of not like an esoteric word or something like that. I'm trying to think of the right one, but it kind of seems somehow in this context to be contradictory, positive and distance. But he said it belongs to topology and to the surface, whereas depth and elevation, which we obviously talked about previously, would restore the negative, i.e. say what something isn't and say what something is. So in those two ideas we have exclusion. Things says what something is, and therefore identity says what something is and excludes what isn't, and the negative says what something isn't. And as you said, yeah, Nietzsche is kind of bringing them both together. They're both along the same line, I would say. So look from health to sickness, and then conversely look from sickness towards health. And he says he has this know-how to reverse perspectives. So it's a perspective of looking from one thing to the other.
Well, and to be the one thing I remember him talking about previous to this as like the ethical thrust is this idea of the counteractualization. And counteractualization he earlier talks about as identification doubled with distance. And now again, we're playing with that same stuff, the idea of distance, the idea of having these elements in this perspectivist sort of play, this way to give yourself that distance from these things. And he's playing with these terms again. It feels like he's returning to that.
I think distance also implies a mediation, because if there's a distance, there's something between them. And I think this next step is something where he talks again about this paradoxical instance. The distance also means difference, because there's this kind of necessity of events or things being mediated. And I think this is where this kind of productive communication happens that produces new things.
And it's
So I have this relationship. He says, so just continue from the Nietzsche quote, we cannot identify contraries, nor can we affirm their entire distance, except as that which relates one to the other. Health affirms sickness when it makes its distance from sickness an object of affirmation. So there's, in that sentence, there's that relationship's being set up. Distance is that arm's length, affirmation of that which it distances. So if going back to these earlier example of the two kind of propositions, which kind of one will exclude the other or one will affirm the other, there's a kind of a different one. So you have a basic proposition, then a thing which affirms it is at a lower level. We have this relationship between propositions which are here on the face of exclusionary, i.e. health and sickness, but there is a relationship given in through this idea of distance. It's the distance from it it's an object of affirmation. The fact it is distant from it allows it to affirm it. So he goes on. So he talks about Nietzsche and his lack of health, shall we say? He says, "Is this not what? Is it not this which permits Nietzsche to experience a superior health at the very moment that he is sick? So this ability to kind of look towards health from the perspective of sickness. So he said, is this not, this is what permits Nietzsche to experience superior health at the very moment he's sick. Conversely, Nietzsche does not lose his health when he is sick, but when he can no longer affirm the distance, when he is no longer able, by means of his health, to establish sickness as a point of view on health. Then, as the Stoics say, the road is over, the play has ended. And he talks a little bit about this notion of point of view, which is this perspectival view of things.
So what he means by distance, the distance of, between his condition and himself, right? It's not perspective of, not allowing his perspective to be conditioned by his condition of health or sickness. Putting
I
himself.
think distance is what.
Yeah, putting himself.
Distance is the thing. Two things. Sorry.
Yeah. No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think distance is the thing where two things are different from each other. So they have a distance, but in this sense that they're able to kind of connect to each other from the perspective of one. You can look towards the other. You can affirm the other. So there is this relationship within normal kind of logic. Health would dismiss sickness, would contradict sickness, and vice versa. But he's saying here that the distance is what the distance is kind of a almost literal idea, in that the distance provides the distance is what enables a perspective to be taken. The point of view. Point of view is the thing from which you see something.
Exactly right.
And it's necessary to have a distance to have a point of view, or to have a perspective on something.
Right. But he's saying that his the point of view means that he's going to distance himself from his own interpretive point of view. He recognized that his point of view is an interpretation. So put a distance between that yourself has a point of view and the opposite of that, which would be a kind of perspective that avoids being trapped in a particular point of view, an interpretation.
It's going back to the idea of the actor. If we want to talk about the actor, the way that a counter-actualization works versus an actualization, that what an actor does, and he says it pretty distinctly, more mimes. I'm not going to go into mimes though. They immediately place themselves in a position of distance to things, to the elements, and as such, they're able to play with them in a different way and work with counter-actualizations, which changes sort of how they operate and how things sort of work. There's a few elements to it that way.
Right. So distance is a recognition that you're playing a role on the stage of life, and you're aware of that.
Yep.
Well, I think the idea is the notion of playing a role. I think the inability to establish the distance is the end of the role. The road is over, the play. This is the quote from the Stoics. The road is over, the play is ended. So it seems to be essential that one can have distance from the thing to its opposite.
Yes, I agree.
So, and it continues a little bit on this paragraph. So point of view doesn't signify a theoretical judgment. As for a procedure, it is life itself. So I think this next bit is interesting. It is from Leibniz, we had already learned that there are no points of view on things, but that things, beings, are themselves points of view. Leibniz, however, subjects points of view to exclusive rules, such that each open itself onto the others, and insofar they converge. So he gives an example, the points of view on the same town. So with Nietzsche, on the contrary, the point of view is open onto our divergence. So Leibniz they both have this perspectival point of view, but with Nietzsche, with Leibniz, it's to control things towards a kind of single point, whereas Nietzsche, he says the point of view is opened onto a divergence which it affirms. So another town corresponds to each point of view. Each point of view is another town. The towns are linked only by their distance. They resonate only through the divergence of theories, their houses and their streets. So there's sort of seemingly endless divergence through the idea of Nietzsche's point of view, which I think is implicit in Leibniz. To be honest with you, man, that's my feeling about Leibniz from what I've read. I haven't read that much, but there is that. It seems implicit in what he's saying that it's endless, but Leibniz wants to pull it back towards a single view, which is the kind of the kind of theological thing which Deleuze objects to.
Yeah, God's perspective. Because all of his things about compatibility or incompatibility come back to the paradox of God can't create things that go against his own nature. Like there's he's so good in how he handles this. He only builds things in his own nature. So there's, I think, a very singular perspective that Leibniz is ultimately appealing towards. I think you're spot on.
Yeah, it's right. I think that's what he does. But yeah, the thing is that within this notion of monads, there's endless monads. So, and it goes back to like Borges, the kind of the idea of the story of the garden of infinitely diverging paths. So, so he says Nietzsche's perspectivism is a much more profound art than Leibniz's point of view. So he's now, what Deleuze is doing is differentiating fundamentally the same thing, but he's given them different names. So he talks about Nietzsche's perspectivism.
So Nietzsche's,
as opposed to Leibniz's point of view. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, so Nietzsche has a perspectivism which is infinite. There are infinite interpretations of existence, whereas Leibniz is it ultimately goes back to one perspective, that of God's perspective, which is the best of all possible worlds, right?
That is his assumption. Again, it's very much in that direction of what God wants, and God is ultimately good and all of that. I do have to plug an earlier episode. We did a reading of Borges' Garden of Forking Paths. It's wonderful. Thank you, Jack, for doing that. It's worth digging back in the podcast history for those of you listening, because it's a great analysis on it. Have to bring it up because it was fucking great. So there you go. So, is it worth moving to? So we've got, God damn it, 3 more pages of this, and this is where it starts getting really dense. I would put a question out because we have about 15 minutes left, really. Would this be a good place for us to actually take a break, spend some time talking through stuff we've already discussed, not move forward in this, and then next week pick back up from here and discuss the rest of this sort of with a fine-tooth comb, because the rest of this, to me, is every 3 or 4 sentences is worth stopping, reading, discussing, and moving through, because we end on some very difficult things that's necessary for the 25th series, and I don't think it's worth rushing through. So, you know what? I'm just going to make executive decision. Unless anyone hard disagrees, now speak now or forever hold your peace.
It's a good idea. Thanks.
All right, then that's what I'm going to do, because I genuinely, like, I think we will. I think, Derek said when we were first starting, he's like, hey, it's worth discussing. And it's like, I agree. I want to spend the next 10 minutes discussing what we've already discussed, 10, 15. But I think we need the time. I want to spend the time on the next week. So we'll do that. But for now, let's continue discussing everything that's been said to this point. If you have questions or commentary, please, now would be the time. Type it in chat. Unpause yourself and start yelling. We're happy to take you. I will edit it out of recordings if you ask me to. Feel free to be rude. But now would be the time. Let's jump back a little bit and talk through what we've discussed so far, if you have questions. And then if no one answers, Derek, you and I'll just start.
I just wanted to ask about the Leibniz's compossibilities and incompatibilities. Is he saying that there are these two kinds of monads, and they are both um, you know in existence, and that
I don't
So,
think monads are compossible or incompossible. It's just the relation. If I think it's referring to the entire series. Again, what we said earlier, the Caesar crosses the Rubicon, these kind of examples. If a monad is incompossible, that means that it cannot exist in the world where Caesar crosses the Rubicon, or
okay.
it cannot exist where he didn't cross the Rubicon. It's not an attribute of monads itself. It's about how they relate to each other.
Okay. So they
I'm sorry. I was just going to say. I think the I don't know a lot about Leibniz at all, to be honest with you. Only what I've read through Deleuze. But one of the ideas I think there is that is the notion of monads, in which contains. So, for example, the example, as I think it was when he said earlier, we talked about Julius Caesar, who famously crossed the Rubicon. So, in the concept of the idea of Julius Caesar is the idea that he crossed the Rubicon, and you cannot take that out of the kind of when dealing with this monad of Julius Caesar. It's there. It's part. It's what this individual little world. It's the world contained within this monad is of Julius Caesar. Is that Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon? It's something you can't take out. But my understanding, I might be wrong here completely. So, but my understanding is that there are other monads which are possible. So, for example, Julius Caesar didn't cross the Rubicon, but that would be a completely different world inhabited by a Julius Caesar who didn't cross the Rubicon. And so one other thing I'd just like to say, it just occurred to me that the word incompossible seems to bring together the word incompatible and possible. So I don't know if that's just me, but so these were terms that Deleuze has been talking about: compatibility, incompatibility. But there's obviously the thing we haven't really spoken about is possibility, which is an important term, which I think relates more to the kind of standard logic of propositions, whether something's possible or not possible. But so it seems to be that this neologism, which I would imagine Leibniz invented, created, but I don't know, I'm just guessing here, brings together within one word notion incompatibility and possibility into one thing.
and I don't think actually Leibniz spent a ton of time on the word incompossible. I think that's been a thing that has kind of spurred from him, because I think mostly Leibniz, and again, I have probably less understanding than Derek, and he gave a hell of an asterisk on top of what he was saying. So just continue that for me. But the entire idea of compossible is Leibniz had like a really positive view of the world, and that like this beautiful place, and here's why it's so great. It's great because God gives us everything he can. Like, it's a very like high, happy view of things. And so I don't think he spent a ton of time in the stuff that I've read of his ever saying incompossible. I think that's a thing that has kind of derived since then from the idea of everything being compossible. I think he spoke of incompossibles almost as impossibilities, but essentially within this set of compossibilities as a relation. So it's, Leibniz, it's interesting. Deleuze's book on Leibniz, I've been told, is not a great translation of the original, the English version. I'm looking for a better version, but it got a lot of really good ideas across. And I mean, Deleuze goes into Leibniz a few times. He went into him in cinema as well, which is where I first sort of came to him. So just to quote real quick from a play from Stanford, When Leibniz speaks of a possible world, he means a set of compossible finite things God could have brought into existence if he were not constrained by the goodness that is part of his nature. The actual world, on the other hand, is simply that set of finite things that is instantiated by God because it is greatest in goodness, reality, and perfection. Naturally, the fact that we are here experiencing the world, the actual world, means that there is at least one possible world, so are there others. This is the place of why he uses the term compossible. It is possibility space. Like, that's very much his intention. And he's playing sort of from that direction. All right. Anyone else? Before I start yelling at Derek and trying to figure out some things myself. We're open. I'm happy to have awkward long silences. All right, maybe no one has anything. Derek, you got anything else you want to chat through?
No, not really. I think we've. I mean, yeah, I think it's. I think that, yeah, like I said, I think this focus of this is fundamentally logic. It's about what's the way in which speech or expression, the way it functions, and yeah, no, not really. I think it's been interesting. It's been useful. We might, that's what, that's all I can say, really.
Yeah, I've come around. I actually think communication of events, the phrasing would be how we communicate events, how we sort of utilize language to communicate events happening and how that works with us. I do think you're right in that.
Yeah. It's how the events will communicate in terms of that they can communicate in not only in their coming together, but also in their divergence. And in fact, this is the example that we ended with, this notion of distance, in which they have this notion of perspective or point of view from which things are seen. The things aren't excluded from one another, so the things they communicate through this perspective or point of view.
When a different repetition uses communication in like a very technical sense. He talks about the thing, the dark precursor, and there I think he means like communication in like a very like information theory cybernetics way. So in the sense that there are these kind of differential relations. So I'm not sure if he means. I'm not sure if he means like. I mean, this also confused me. Like if he means communication in like a more colloquial sense, or in this kind of very technical sense that he uses it in different repetition. Although it seems to me that like given the series that comes after, and what he says about the logical and static genesis, that seems to me that he's trying to develop a kind of system of events, which brings back one question I had in the beginning, which is to me like one of the big questions in Deleuze is kind of this question of agency, like to fix work without a subject, like who does what, because which I mean is a big question, but it's something that always kind of confuses me also here, because like when he talks about the butterflies, like it doesn't really seem like a purely like linguistic thing. It seems kind of ontological, like they have these properties. But then there are other examples where like he starts seems that is mostly about what is being said. Yeah, and it's just general confusion. It's obviously like not something that that's easy to discuss, but something that I've noticed again here that he kind of jumps around with his examples.
So this idea of necessity and destiny. So the language is what sends us into that gives us the ability to posit destiny and be separated from necessity, right? And
I would say that it's I think I mean that's I think going to be the point as we start moving forward here is answering that overall. I think my early version of answering that would be as we talk about things becoming actualized, events and all of these things. We can talk through the destiny of things, which there is a reality to life, I suppose I would say. There's bodies, things are moving, things are happening. The use of language towards a necessity that's determinate is, I think, the challenge. And if we're going to be utilizing language or things truly just simply as an actualization towards necessity, I think his argument would be we should take a step, go the other way. Oh, sorry, Derek. Your mic was on. I muted you for a second. Sorry. The other step is that we still need to counter-actualize, and we need to talk through how that functions in order for us to be able to sort of break apart these assumed determinate necessities of action. That's how I think this is aiming at this point. Please, Derek, go ahead.
No, it's fine. I just noticed. I just been muted for a bit, so not a problem.
Well, now you have to talk. Now you have to talk.
Yeah, I think sorry. No, what you just said actually is interesting because I think essentially it's so the idea of events and things like this that they're given off in language or in speaking or whatever. They're incorporeal. They have no bodies, and yet we have that example of the actor who's a physical person who's engaging in speaking, and through that activity they're creating events. So yeah, I think that's an interesting example, I would say.
so the actor in playing this role and creating an event is kind of like beyond goes beyond affirming affirming a kind of destiny and denying his necessity, right? His his actual body and existence is there, but he's kind of like in the realm of language. He's participating in a kind of expression that affirms the event, which is destiny.
I'm not sure if we can apply the ideas of necessity and destiny to the activity of an actor. My feeling is that it's a different kind of thing because we have the body of the actor and the incorporeal character that's been created by the actor. I mean, I think the phrase that made an impression on me is that Deleuze says the actor strains his personality. He has this notion of straining personality to create the actor. I think I'm not sure that's completely correct. I think it's a different thing. I think the notion of destiny and necessity in terms of what's spoken is a much more prosaic kind of use of language in which in the way things will happen in the world. Rather, I mean, I think the acting is a different type of activity, I would say.
Well, it feels like acting would be, let's say that
it's just essentially it's a kind of it's a relationship between what must happen and what might happen.
Let's talk. So, because we have on the one side we have destiny, which is the unity of bodies, the things as they are, the bodies, my house, my body, the microphone here, the fucking computer, all this stuff, the bodies as they are. The necessity is, if I don't do X, Y will not happen. It's a determinate demand within events almost entirely itself that certain things need to be ordered, or events need to be ordered in a certain way to drive us towards certain outcomes. Whereas destiny, which is the physical reality of things, is what it is, and things are moving as they're moving, or are doing what they're doing. It's my ability inside of that as an actor, as a person, as a mime, however you want, is I get to counter-actualize. I get to, as people discuss events and actualize them, I get to step away from them, and I can turn them on their head immediately, so that way people become less attached to events as reality, and instead stay more directly connected towards imminent experience. Necessity is the opposite of that. Necessity is me saying into the future or past, extending into aeon, that there is a reality to those things when they're completely incorporeal. Life becomes destiny in that point. I don't think that's necessarily what he's talking about here when he says destiny, more that we have to affirm it in the way the Stoics talked about it, which is the reality of bodies on the ground, the way that they, like the way that things actually are, the relations of things, the bodies and the mixture themselves, the whole unity.
I think it's destiny. My feeling about it is that it has a relationship to the future, and it's something that must happen. So if you say something's your destiny, then it will happen. And then, but I think necessity also has a relationship to the future. And in fact, Deleuze says that normally necessity follows destiny. So if we have a destiny, then necessity is the means through which destiny is arrived at. But I think the idea of necessity is that it has different ways in which it can be reached, different kind of paths that can be followed to get there. And I think the other idea of necessity, is that it's not the only thing through which the future can be achieved. I think that's the other thing. Within the kind of standard relationship between destiny and necessity, we have a destiny, and then necessity, it can be this or it can be that. It's either or, that kind of way of thinking. But I think with the kind of Stoic idea, that starts to be detached. It's not necessity anymore.
Well, so
destiny is still there, definitely.
Well, it's to go back to the example that I like that Chrysippus used, that Chrysippus says, it may indeed be the case that getting better requires and implies going to a doctor. But as is typical with Stoic paralogisms, the conclusion to the lazy argument does contain a grain of truth. Convalescing and visiting the doctor may be co-fated, but from the point of view of fate, the relation between the two events is quasi-causal, not causal. Going to the doctor does not cause you to get better. These things are co-fated, co-destined, I think would be another way that we could use it here. These elements appear next to each other. They do, and they happen regularly. It's a pattern recognition thing we've done. Oh, look, if I relax, I take this medicine and I go to the doctor, I get better. And if I drink echinacea and zinc that my mom sends me and have chicken soup, I also get better. These things may be co-fated, but from destiny, from that point of view, these are not causal elements. These are quasi-causal. These things don't cause you to get better. That's not how it works. And this is the thing Deleuze keeps driving at, is that difference, that element between non-causal compatibilities and incompatibilities, which are communications among events affected to the extent that events borrow the power of structural floaters and paradoxical elements, which we're going to be getting into. I don't want to jump too far ahead, but this is how we start getting into that, how these sentences and the structure of sense and nonsense begin sort of controlling us and necessitating actions or demanding things or creating cause and effect when there wasn't any. Things that are co-fated or co-destined, which I think I would say, because they don't use destiny almost at all in Chrysippus's writing. It's not a word he uses. He uses fate. De fato is the book. So to me, it's the fate and co-fated elements. These are bodies that are accurate at any given time, but the things we've applied to them where the causes are the quasi causes, the events, the things we've placed together. They're not causal. That's the difference between necessitating and fate or destiny to me.
It seems like there's two definitions of destiny in terms of chronos and ion, is there?
May I cut in here?
Yes,
Yeah.
I'll look for that real quick, JK. I don't know for sure.
So I think part of the trouble is we're trying to understand the relationship of destiny with time, but at the same time, I think we're having some trouble working out that relationship with temporality, and the relationship between destiny and necessity that Deleuze is saying the Stoics break with, right? And they have the paradox there. So when he says destiny, I think what he's talking about is the relationship of bodies and their mixtures, right? So if you go back to the second series, I think you get that more directly where he's working out all bodies are causes in relation to each other and causes for each other. But causes of what? They are causes of certain things of an entirely different nature. These effects are not bodies, but properly speaking, incorporeal entities. And then he is going to go into how effects exist and draw these distinctions between not physical qualities, which would be causality and still apply to destiny, right? Where destiny is this question of qualities, I think more of being, and I think more of how the relationships between bodies and their properties come into mixtures with each other, right? Because that's what's coming out of the earth when we have the eternal return, where we have this temporalization of chronos with the bodies, right? The present, and the way that the what's in the depths, the destiny of this larger relationship between the two that is in this kind of interiority is brought to the surface where the effects are. And I think that's kind of how he's conceiving this eternal return. Because when we talk about, like in your example, healing, right, there's a way in which the past and future are implicated because we're talking about ion. We're talking about recovery, as I understand it, happening to the person. So when Deleuze says, right, it's not necessity, going to the doctor isn't it's not necessarily the case that going to the doctor must provide the action of healing, and that that this must take place as the event. I think what he's getting at is that the event in this production happens to produce the effect of healing, right? And in that way, you have this becoming healed. But in that, it's contingent upon relationships of effects, relationships of bodies, which ultimately is your destiny, and that between the two, which is going to give you your connection between Chronos and Aeon, where on the one hand you have the limit in Chronos, right? You have that Zeus aspect. But then on the other hand, you have the way in which Aeon is actually changing all of that, right? So like to use an example, right, that kind of works in ontology and logic. If we look at like Tarski, right, the standard theory of truth, snow is white if and only if snow is white. So we can say there's a question of possibility here, right? Must snow always be right? Must snow be white even? And this is the truth of the proposition Tarski is trying to work out, that snow must be white if we find white snow. But you can take this at a larger level, right? Is it essential that snow is white? And I think Deleuze's move is to say, well, it's not a question of the essentiality of white, where a black snow or a yellow snow is adulterated, right? And it's actually white snow, but it just happens to be, um, you know, impure here. It's a question for Deleuze of the mixture of whether it's snow and soot or snow and urine and the production of that, right? Just at the bodily level. So then it's a question of the effects that relate into the production of that or of that yellow or black snow,
We may
right?
we may be saying the same thing, but I'm going to go back to we may be saying the same thing. I'm not fully convinced we are. We may be. For me, to be very clear, necessity is specifically events as bonds of effects, quasi causes. This is what necessity is. Destiny is the connection between causes, the unity of them. This is how he's defined them in the second one. And so as such, we are talking about necessity as being purely within events, and how an event events chain and bond as effects of said causes, that they are separate, and that the Stoics separated them and actually opposed them directly. As opposing the Epicureans, he talks about who cleave causality in a different way, but do it kind of in a weird atomic series whose respective independence is guaranteed by a clinomen. In either case, one begins by splitting causal relations instead of distinguishing types of causality, as Aristotle and Kant would do. The split always refers us back to language, either the existence of declension of causes, or we shall see to the existence of a conjugation of effects. The idea of the effects being collectively in the necessity that then demands action and becomes the quasi-cause of its own reality, or what we feel or we perceive as bodies in the way that they're interacting, which they aren't.
The trouble I have, though, is he doesn't use the word necessity there.
So he specifically says,
are you
the freedom is preserved in two complementary manners, once in the interiority of destiny as a connection of causes, and once more in the exteriority of events as bonds of effects. For this reason, the Stoics can oppose destiny and necessity. That's a fair, direct definition of it, as he puts it. Middle of page 6. He calls one destiny and the other necessity. And necessity is the... And again, he goes back to de fato and has a few pages on that. And again, destiny being the word that I think keeps tripping us up. It's because, again, we're talking about de fato. Destiny, this may be a translational thing. I'd love to know what the original word is that he's using here in French, because it's fate. Like, destiny is never used in Cicero or anything these guys are talking about. Fate's the word that they're using. Destiny is a different, there's different English connotations with it, but for sure we're talking about fate. And as Chrysippus talks about fate, he talks about things being co-fated, which are bodies that are aligned with each other. For example, a person who may be listening to this right now, me sitting here in my chair, Jack being here, Derek being here, all of us talking, and someone understanding anything we're talking about on the other side is co-fated, in theory. Now, if that person sits there and goes, excellent. Now, the reason I was able to understand is because Brooks, Derek, and Jack were talking. That's why I was able to understand. That's necessity. That's purely quasi-cause bullshit that doesn't actually have a reality. We need to step back and go, oh, these things are co-fated, but listening to the three of us is not the cause of that. We help it, like we are co-fated with it, but there's a lot of other things that sort of play into these elements. And this Stoic fatalism that's sort of drawing out is about the silent compossibilities or incompossibilities among events that, again, going back to paradoxes and aleatory points and all these elements, are going to kind of come back in and talk through the structure of how this comes to be.
Sorry, Brooks. Due to the time difference, I couldn't properly participate in this talk. Here, this is like a really early morning.
Sorry. I know
So
it's.
sorry. We wish that really I could participate in that, but I fell asleep in the middle of the talk. Sorry.
No, we'll figure out a way. If you want, we can do other readings and discussions on it some other time and talk through it. It's a really good discussion, I think, for me. But yeah, it's a.
I will listen to this recording again, and I always really appreciate your contribution and dedication, things like that, because it will be quite helpful. Even though it's early here, but it's worth it. Like I can. Oh, but today I was really tired. Sorry about that.
No, you're fine. Before we bounce, I want to read one bit from De Fato. Someone says to him, again, to go back to the astrology point, because while we've been talking, I've been trying to figure out where it is, and it's the 15th phrase, 15th paragraph, whatever, the 15th stanza. At this point, Chrysippus gets nervous and expresses a hope that the Chaldeans and the rest of the prophets are mistaken, that they will not employ conjunctions of propositions, putting out their observations in the form of, this is the proposition, if anyone was born at the rising of the dog star, he will not die at sea, but rather will say, it is not the case, both that some person was born at the rising of the dog star and that the person will die at sea. What an amusing presumption. To avoid falling in the hands of Diodorus himself, he tutors the Chaldeans as to the proper form in which to set out their observation. For I ask you, if the Chaldeans adopt the procedure of setting forth negations of indefinite conjunctions rather than indefinite sequences, why should it not be possible for doctors and geometricians and other professions to do likewise? Take a doctor. He will not set forth a scientific principle that he has ascertained in this form. If a person's pulse is so and so, he has got a fever, but rather as follows. It is not the case that a person's pulse is so and so and that he has got a fever. And similarly, a geometrician will not speak as follows. The greatest circles on a sphere bisect each other, but rather as follows. It is not the case, both, that there are certain circles on the surface of a sphere, and there are the greatest, and these circles do not bisect each other. This discussion he's having specifically in relation to astrology, and his critique of it, I think, is what Deleuze is referencing there. And this is the co-fading of elements, and to step back from the idea of language that seals it, actualizes it, and makes it real as if it was a quasi-cause, but stepping back from such a use of language. It's a great section. I'll pop it in here as a thing. Yeah, with that, it's been too long. Thank all of you for coming. We will make our way slowly and surely to next week, where we will finish out Series 24. We will probably do a chat at some point this week to kind of catch up and figure out how we want to go through it, because it could be possible that we just do a couple sentences and discuss kind of a more of our style of Anti-Oedipus's reading. We'll figure it out as we go. But I'm looking forward to it, and I will chat with all of you next week. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much, and sorry today.